Now, we have two or three commentator or respondent. I begin with Elhag to respond, and then Richard, and then Hakim Moi. And then we take questions, not only to the speaker, but also to the respondent. So, can I ask Elhag, please?
Thank you to Dr. Yaniv Voller for a very enlightening presentation about his book. I have listened to you carefully, and specifically when you are narrating the events of liberation in South Sudan, and I think that's very interesting. Yes, it is true that there are practices transferred from one generation to another generation, specifically in the case of Sudan. However, I think there may be some things, important things that you have not mentioned, but let me say why I'm saying that. One is that the impact of colonialism on the colonized, I think, is not strongly highlighted with the emphasis on power, how that power is transferred from one state or from one government to another government. Let's take the case of Sudan. When Sudan became independent, there were serious issues, and I think these issues impacts on Sudan now and South Sudan as well. For example, I don't think that when the British were ruling Sudan, the Sudanese had an identity. They didn't have an identity, because if you ask any one of them, what is Sudan? Up to now, when I ask this question to many people, still they can't answer it. And so what happened was the power you talk about correctly was transferred to civil servants who were with their colonial power, and they continued with the same practices. What they know is how the previous colonial power managed the situation, and that's what they applied correctly. As you said, the mission is to civilize. And therefore, the Sudanese had to be taught in a certain way and have to be brought to a standard of an acceptable human living, without talking about what is this human living and why is it those issues are not addressed. So this is very important, because this civilization allowed the inculcation of education and cultures of outsiders on the Sudanese people. And it created a class within the education system, in a sense that those who believe that they're highly educated, they begin to think that they are elite, they are superior than the other, creating classes. And so that education basically was more like to produce inferior people, or to make people feel inferior, people who have no confidence. Now, when the British left, the Sudanese, who I believe and I still strongly argue don't have an identity, those who were in power decided to grab the power and had the power of the state. They decided to construct Sudan within their own thinking, a thinking of a very few people. And therefore they decided Sudan is going to be an Islamic Arab country, when the reality is, if you look at Sudan and take it as a whole, it's a country of nationalities with different cultures, different languages. But the majority even do not speak Arabic. So that imposition itself collided with how South Sudan was treated during the colonial period. The Closed District Act, where Southern Sudanese were closed out of the north, and people were allowed to be taught in English. Now they're being reoriented to look at themselves from a European point of view, Eurocentric point of view. And then when Sudan took over, that was also change on the mission of civilization. Now we have to create, you have to be Arabs, you have to study Arabic, and you have to forget about your culture, you have to forget about your identity, true identity. Now, again, we have people in South Sudan, even with the first, all the people who spearheaded what is called liberation are people actually who work within the administrations, okay? And so by articulating their ideas about separation. It's only an idea, again, of a small group of people, not most. There wasn't any consultation of the people whether they wanted to a new state or not. And given the fact that the national identity itself was lacking in itself, and there wasn't a clear social construction in Sudan that shows what the Sudanese truly are, created the problem in South Sudan then. So what happened is this elite or so educated in South Sudan framed the story, decided that we have to break. And the reason is they are justified. They cannot be blamed because one, the Sudan is imposing Arabic culture, imposing Islam, things which they don't want. And I think if the Sudanese state itself, from the very beginning, before the break, if the Sudanese sat down and looked at themselves and asked themselves, what is our identity? What are the things that bind us together? What values do we believe in? South Sudan would not have broken away. Now, the absence of this, which is all created by power, is what happened in South Sudan. Now, strangely, not strangely, as expectedly, we now have in South Sudan a new belief that we must break away from South Sudan. Certain regions in Sudan now are propagating that. And that is because truly as South Sudanese, we don't know who we are. Okay, but there are over 60-something tribes. Out of these 60-something tribes, 3 are kingdoms. Okay, the Zande kingdom, the Anuak kingdom, and the Cholo kingdom. These were all forced together into this space. And these people don't know themselves. They don't know what they share. If you ask them up to now, if you ask South Sudanese, you question the identity of South Sudanese, I believe that many people will not be able to clearly say who is South Sudanese and what is it that we stand for as people in South Sudan. And that has created, again, the same practice as you correctly put it. We are transferring practices from one generation to another generation. The current leaders of groups that want South Sudan to break, if you ask them, they will articulate the issues based on what they see. Okay? And that, again, is something that perhaps they could learn. If the new people want to break away, they need to begin to consult, talk to the people, understand what the people want, whether they would be able to come together. And the absence of that, I think, is what perpetuates these problems. Another 2 things that I think perhaps you could have mentioned was the impact of international global structures. Because this calls for separation is not just because, but because the things that are done at the higher level, the structures, the global impacts and filters down. Say, for example, some European powers or some Eastern powers will help one group against the other for their own personal interests. And this is something that is also very important that should be considered. And lastly, I think the role of education as a destructive and as a constructive, I think is very important, because education is used as a weapon in changing people mentally, mental colonization. I think the mental colonization is something that perhaps could have thrown much, because I think in South Sudan we were mentally colonized, because there is this, if you go to Juba, for example, and you don't speak Arabic at that time, they'll say, they're Ahali. It means you are a villager, you know nothing, you're not civilized. And this is, somebody might laugh at it, but it's a serious issue because it impacts, it creates issues of division. And so mental colonization is the final thing. Thank you for that. And I think I agree with all the things that you've done here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Richard, please.
Thanks. Thanks, Yaniv, for a really fascinating presentation about the book, and I'll look forward very much to reading it. And yeah, the questions that it prompted me to think about begin with this, thinking about your identification, setting out of the colonial and anti-colonial methods that you identified, you summarized a list of 5 methods used by the Sudan government, quasi-colonial methods: use of violence, demographic engineering, revival or distortive revival of so-called indigenous administrations or institutions, divide and rule based on ethnic, tribal militias, and use of a civilizational discourse. When I saw that list of 5, I was thinking, oh, how many of these methods have been used in subsequent conflicts? Looking at that list of 5, thinking how many of those methods have been used in the wider Sudan and South Sudan conflicts post 2005 or after South Sudan's full independence in 2011. I thought maybe at least four out of those 5 I would recognise in the kind of recent period, and then likewise I asked myself the question, looking at your summary of the methods used by Southern Sudanese rebels. You listed 3: adopting an anti-colonial discourse, adopting a nativist discourse and treating northerners as foreigners, resorting to guerrilla tactics characteristic of liberation movements. How many of those methods have been used in South Sudan since 2011, or particularly since December 2013? And I thought perhaps 2 out of those 3. I'd be interested what your reflections have been as you've been doing your research on Southern Sudan's history. You did your research in the 2010s, I understand. So you'll have kind of witnessed what was going on in newly independent South Sudan's post 2011 history. And then, I note your conclusion that colonialism and decolonisation have tended to be treated as limited historical episodes, but cases such as South Sudan and the Kurdistan region of Iraq, they challenge that thinking. They provide good reason to question it and to think that, to consider that colonialism, or colonial and anti-colonialism, that they are sets of practices and roles and norms and methods, and as you said, a set of practices and values that can be used by any movement demanding justice. Have you seen that in some of the South Sudanese small and larger movements, political and military movements in the past decade? As Elhag mentioned, are we seeing a transfer of practices from one generation to the next, and are we seeing these in a kind of third generation struggles that use many of the same practices that were seen before? So those are the reflections and questions that come to my mind. Thanks very much. I'll pass on to Hakim.
Thank you. I must introduce Hakim. Hakim Moi is a journalist, a writer, an activist. He has, if you have seen the books on South Sudan, he contributed an article, extremely good article on South Sudan. And we are very glad to have him back, Hakim, with us again. Thank you for coming and for offering a contribution towards the topic. Okay.
Thank you for the privilege. I found the book to be interesting, but the main focus of my observation is about this decolonization discourse. This decolonization discourse, as you rightly pointed out, probably you haven't addressed other aspects of the decolonization process. For example, you take the colonial state, that resulted from a conference that took place in Europe that divided Africa into many states. Vast majority of these countries still retain their borders today. And then there is also the question of identity within these states. In the case of Sudan, decolonization discourse at the state level ultimately resulted in a failed state, which is what we see today. And so that is one of the failures of decolonization discourse in the context of Sudan. And also this, by extension, applies to South Sudan, because the process of decolonization, which means that we liberate ourselves from the colonial ethos, the processes of the colonial, framework and all of that. We want to create a state, a new state. And this state is premised on the Westphalian state model, the sovereign state. And then it throws up the challenge of creating a sense of identity, a sense of being a nation, that the new activists, or rather the new political elites who want now to create a new state, have not progressed sufficiently in terms of defining what does it mean for them and for their people. What does decolonization means? This question, like you said, probably has been addressed in the context of borrowing these models, borrowing the analogy of this country, of that country that has inherited this power structure in the state, and now it's inherited by this elite without reviewing it, like critiquing this model of the state, because there are incompatibilities. If you take the example of South Sudan, and Elhag referred to potential voices now, even talking about the third generation of decolonization. Okay, so there's a challenge in the international law as it relates to Africa, that the extent to which decolonization may need to proceed is the next level in which the peoples of these countries have to revise, or rather rethink the state in terms of creating successful states, coexisting peoples who would be able to live together in peace among themselves, like a coexistence model. So if that means, for example, the boundaries of the colonial heritage have to change, then that needs to be facilitated in the interest of peace. And we have seen this playing out in Yugoslavia, in the former Yugoslavia, where you have a conglomeration of many nationalities. They failed to live and coexist together with each other. And then what they ended up doing was that, okay, let's go our separate ways. And actually going your separate ways would help bring you together at some point when you start to begin to think in terms of commonalities, benefits, mutual interests of working together. So this is the challenge that we have today in South Sudan. We have many social groups. I wouldn't want to describe them as tribes. These are different social groups. And these social groups, since South Sudan became independent, they have not sat together down to agree a constitution of how they want to live together in the model of the state, the modern state. This has not happened because there's simply a transfer of Sudan, and they were talking about two Sudans now, the Sudan and then the South Sudan. And both states are now failed states. So the lesson for South Sudan, for example, would be to recognize the existing social groups, and in the interest of peace, these different social groups should come together and sit down and say, how do we want to live together with each other? What is the best system that can support our coexistence? And this coexistence cannot be imposed. this coexistence needs to be agreed by consensus. For example, you have Equatoria, you have Upper Nile, and you have Bahr el-Ghazal. They lived as separate, or they were administered as separate units, like provinces of Equatoria, Upper Nile, Bahr el-Ghazal. And they were in the process of, struggle together because they had a pressure. The enemy to them was the North. They were united by being Africans. And now that they're kind of like free from that, they have not recognized whether this is the best form of state that they should, continue to maintain, because we are not able to live to the expectations of what the state is. So I think the discourse should start to look at, in terms of decolonization, how far down the line, when you take this concept of decolonization, what is it that you are decolonizing? It might be that we have to reconfigure the states in Africa. So that's the other, so that we can begin to put all of these conflicts that take place in Africa in the context of decolonization. Maybe Africa is going back to what it used to be before it was divided into these states. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hakim. We will have some questions, but before we start, I'd like just to make a comment about Elhag Arabization. I think the concept of Arabization in Sudan and being taken as if it is a policy, it's outside Khartoum. There was no talk or a protest at all about Arabization. It's only the tiny group of people in Khartoum who advocated such policy. Why I'm saying this, I'll tell you an example. When Nimeri came to power in 1969, in 1970, I was asked personally by Muhyiddin Sabr, who Nimeri appointed as Minister of Education, to appear before him to see about programs for the anthropology sociology of University of Khartoum. So I went there to the Ministry of Education, sat, and they were very generous, tea, coffee, cake, biscuit, fine. So we sat, at that time, Ministry of Education was on the Blue Nile, next to the Blue Nile Cinema. That was the building. So there were other people. So his secretary, who was the cultural attaché in the ministry, in the embassy in London, Sudanese embassy, Ibrahim. So he used to come, the French group, came up, geography group, the history group, English group, and then remained, and who was with me? Fahima Zahir. She was, that time teaching anthropology, just graduated from Manchester. So Ibrahim came to us, he said, "Oh, Ahmed, I'm terribly sorry. Muhyiddin Sabr, he did all the program for the anthropology." So I said, "Ibrahim, we have been waiting for 2-3 hours. Why didn't you tell us from the beginning?" Now, here we go. It is by stroke, the introduction of Arabic in the educational system in Sudan, and it is collapsed to this very day. During my time, any university graduate from Khartoum will be accepted in any Western university. Now, where are they? The whole system copied from the Egyptian model of Malafat and learning by heart, right? So this is what happened. It's nothing to do with the Sudanese outside Khartoum. It's a purely Khartoum Nasir Afendiya. Now, I open the discussion for question and answer.
Thank you. My name is Ahmed Al-Shahi.
Yeah.
I'm very grateful for this kind of research, because some of the topics for us we find very difficult even to access from Durham University. Before, it's easy to go through the library and open all those books, papers in South Sudan and all this. But now it's very difficult. Yeah. One of the things you said that encourages, what is it, they knew about the liberation of South Sudan when they broke down. Do you think that is the common denominator between the Kurds and South Sudan? So the common denominator as indigenous people, we are fighting for our homeland against the Arabs. That's how we propagate. Because when I was in the Barakai age of 13, I remember we used to talk about Che Guevara and Joseph Castro. I don't know why, you know. And I discovered that our leaders used to read that, what is it called, about their liberation. But the other things I want to focus, this is the question for, this is the question for you about the common denominator. The other things I just want to talk about the Arab is a little bit, because when Nigeria came to power, he changed the whole system in Sudan to Arabic. And the reason why, because of when they joined the Arab League. So everything has to be the Arabic. Even the Egyptian try even to Arabize the chemistry. And they found it very, very difficult, especially the formula. So in universities, they have to go back and use the English formula, but the lecture is in Arabic. Because I study physics and chemistry in Egypt. But for that, I just want to.
But Amal, Sudan was part of the Arab League before Nigeria came to power.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I say that's the reason. Like,
you know, because you are linking this with that. But actually,
okay, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You want to answer this question?
Sure, absolutely. Is it okay also if I try to respond to some of the comments that have been made before by the and then also to answer this
and
question?
Then to Amal.
No, I think because some of this, particularly the comments about Arabization or Sudanization, right? I think that it's a good indication of the failure of post-colonial state building. It wasn't just unique to Sudan. It wasn't just unique to Iraq. There was a sense, I think, that it was the way in which the process of establishing new states is now down to this bureaucratic process of recognizing, granting international recognition to a new state, but without any consultation. Well, it was at the end of the day done without any consultation with the local population. Right? There wasn't any effort trying to, okay, how do we take this institution, the institution of the state, and try to and then use it to establish, identity. I mean, it's very difficult because it's very difficult. I mean, can we imagine a different way of organizing the colonized people after decolonization? Can we imagine a different way other than the state? Can we imagine a different institution? Can we imagine a different constellation? It's very difficult. And this is also why, Richard, I was addressing your question. I didn't encounter it when I visited initially in 2013, but in 2014 and 2015 and later in 2018, I did actually meet people who said, yeah, we need, we've now been subject to Dinka domination, right? So we need to establish a new state. Equatorial need to secede. So there's a vicious cycle here. It's very difficult to break because we can't. It's very difficult to imagine a different constellation, a different way for people to fight injustice. Right? People sense injustice. They feel that they're being treated, they're being marginalized and excluded. And the most immediate solution is to create a new state. And it's definitely an outcome of the process of decolonization. And in response to, I'm really glad that I do get a chance to make some comparison, to make some reference to the Kurdish question as well, in response to the question by the colleague over there. It wasn't just a common denominator between the Kurds and the South Sudanese, by the way. It was also a common denominator, but the idea that we're facing this predicament was also shared by Iraq and Sudan, right? By the Iraqi and Sudanese government. It's the sense that we're sharing the same problem. In the book I mentioned, there's a story that I managed to find in the archives. I managed to find a report about the chief of police in Equatoria going in 1970 to meet with the Minister of Interior in Iraq. And what did the Iraqis do? They took this chief of police to northern Iraq, to Kurdistan, to show them how they're dealing with their insurgency. Right? There was, and then after, and when he left, they actually gave him a present, a police helicopter that they could use. Right? So there was a sense of, there is a constant sense of learning. You can imagine that the Kurds and the Southern Sudanese didn't share too many things in common in terms of historical experiences and of course language, but they did actually share a sense of being treated unjustly and being marginalized and persecuted, but because they were products of the same period, and because they were the products of the same processes, they ended up embracing also the same, and also the same discourses. The Kurds also speak of, and again, I showed this a little bit, the Kurds also speak of Arab colonialism and Arab imperialism, and and about themselves as Kurds as being part of a movement, of a global movement, anti-colonial movement. And there was a much more important sense, there was a much more important sense of solidarity than many others.
But the Kurds, they had a republic, and who dismantled the republic? Not the Arabs,
it's true,
not the Persian, not the Turks, but the West with the Celtic speakers.
Yeah, it's true,
So now the Kurds have to face Turkish culture, Persian culture, and Arab culture.
Yeah, it's much more
complicated.
It's a much more complicated sense of marginalization, because you're being marginalized by 3 different cultures.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
I just wanted to say something.
Oh yes, okay.
I just wanted to say something regarding the transfer of our own my reference earlier to the impact of international community on local politics, because what led to the separation of South Sudan from Sudan was the CPA. Now the CPA was internationally and foreign imposed because the opposition in the north and south were not given part play. They were not asked, which meant the majority of the Sudanese people by then were not asked. It was only SPLM and the NIF party. And the SPLM, as we knew, was completely tribal, militarily organized in a tribal sense. And what has happened is they've just taken the state and handed it to the young people. This is what has happened, and so replicates that situation. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, yes, please.
Well, Mr. I am Matthew. First time I come here, great presentation.
Ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome.
Shalom. Yeah, this is a great presentation. I just want to touch upon all the points which all 4 of you have made today, and keep my thoughts and my analysis. Also, a few questions. Hopefully, the dialogue will enlighten us. So, first of all, you are right. The Treaty of Westphalia, which you said, which gave the basis of the present nation states, what constitutes a nation state, which Sudan tried to create a nation state, came to arise through multiple conflicts and multiple compromises. And then they said, you know what, we are the best talking to each other and we can solve our problems. And then what secure international system was built. Back again to talk about what you said earlier about the Berlin Conference. Now, the Berlin Conference, when they split Africa and they scrambled different regions, was predominantly because they were stepping on each other's toes. Because they were fighting over different regions. And then we culminated in the war, the short incidents in 1800s, which the French and the English were fighting over a particular area. And now that then leads when all these independent nations were then independent, you have to ask yourself the question. You are first of all not a nation state. Number one, within the greatest nation state called Sudan, there are multiple tiny nations inside. The 4, the Oriental Kingdom, Nuba, the Chola, the Ahmad, there are multiple different nations. Now they're put in this one geographical place, and to not go through the process of debating and arguing and then getting understanding of each other and then comes to compromise. That did not happen. so the trustee to the modern international system. That in of itself is a recipe for failure. So this project was doomed from the start. Now, the second thing is, you mentioned that I grew up in the 1990s. So in the 1960s, I wasn't alive. But my experience in the 1990s was that, yes, the problem wasn't Arabization. The problem is cultures works through languages. The quickest way to understand somebody's culture is to understand their language. You get a better understanding of what kind of person he's dealing with. Now, the problem was that when Mary introduced the, it's not so much as the Arabic language, it's the baggage that comes with political Islam. That's the problem. That's where the problem originated. In the 1990s, I grew up in Khartoum, where all the students were wearing army uniforms. Who were they going to fight? They were told they're going to be martyrs. They're all going to go to heaven. On who was their ticket to heaven? So those questions, because now it's not so much Arabization. Yes, Arabization is it's not the language, it's the cultural baggage that comes with the language. Those are the root cause. Now, you said to me that you already mentioned that Sudan is going to be the breadbasket of Africa. When he says breadbasket of Africa, he's not talking about Shindi or what area of the country is he talking about? It's a country with the most natural resources. So my question, based on my preload, is to understand the colonial project. We need to understand it as a transfer of resources. That's what colonialism is. Who gets what and when? And the problems, if you look at, if you take it from Cairo to Cape Town, all liberation problems fail because one project is to build a person, the other project is to build a house. These are two different problems. So most colonialist power or liberation powers that became government, they're ill-equipped to rule because the tools that they have at their disposal are liberation. My question to you is, yes, you talk about new colonies, you talk about the people adapting the first generation's problems, but I think it makes a lot more sense, and maybe I could be wrong, and please correct me if I am, it could make a lot more sense if you see it as a transfer of resources. And the current liberation struggle in the north and the south till 2023 boils down to this. And please correct me if I'm wrong.
Thank you very much indeed. Can we take more questions? Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Yaniv Voller, and mine is more of a comment than anything else. You see, in the context of South Sudan, I think the whole problem is the colonial legacy. When we talk about how Sudan was formed, South Sudan, British colonized Sudan with the Egyptians. They imposed a particular kind of policy on Egypt. And when they departed, and were run by the condominium rule by the Egyptians and the British, there was a particular set of policies that were imposed themselves on the Sudanese. They actually separated people. They created a difference between peoples within the same country. Now, when we got independence, that is Sudan, in 1956, there was already a different set of people who considered themselves elite. And those are the people who took over power. Because they had a different mindset, which was imposed by the colonialists themselves, they began imposing it onto the others. So what happens? Basically what I'm saying is, what is happening in South Sudan now within the context of the organization itself is all part of the legacy of the colonialists.
But if I just reply to you, many Sudanese think Sudan was a colony. Sudan wasn't a colony. It was ruled by British, by British and Egyptian. If it was a colony, it would be part of the Commonwealth organization. Sudan not member of that. Yes, certain colonial policy adopted by the British, like indirect rule, yes, that was. But it wasn't a colony. Any definition.
I didn't suggest physical colony. I said
No, I know that. I know you're absolutely right. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Okay, Nazar.
Thank you. My name is Nazar. Thank you to Dr. Voller and Haj, Richard, and Hakim. My questions will be to four of you, but I would love to hear Dr. Voller and Elhag, because he did mention a few things which is linked to my three questions, which are going to say quick. What do you think about the act of eradication of cultural and historical legacy of indigenous communities while reshaping them according to standard cultural and economic framework? Number two, over 20 countries, Western countries, population are under 2 million. Why not Africa, and in this case, South Sudan, as an answer to the question of if we talk about Equatoria or Dinka, Shuluk, or Zandi? And my last question is, what do you think about New Sudan vision by Dr. John Grant? Will it work to unite the South Sudan? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Rosemary, please.
My name is Rosemary Damaji. My question is, do you think the reason colonization and decolonization look the same is because of lack of originality of thought among the leaders?
Rosemary, this is the kind of thing I love to see. Very short, very precise, and very thin. Thank you, rather than comment. Anyone? Yes, please. Yes, you.
Hi, my name's Amanda.
Hello,
thank
Amanda.
you, Dr. Voller, for the insightful talk. I just wanted to ask, I understand that you're researching based on interest, but there are other separatist movements in the region, like Eritrea from Ethiopia and also Somaliland from Somalia, and it would have been nice perhaps to have some context of what was going on in the region as well that may colour our understanding of what was going on in Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions for the first round? No more questions, so I'll ask my colleague to answer, if they wish to answer any one of the questions being asked by the participant.
I'll do it very fast. So I think there was, my favorite thing in relation to your question, I mean, what was the nation state doing from the start? In retrospect, we may say so, right? I mean, but I think maybe it also responds to Rodney's question, right? I mean, was it just a lack of originality? When you're facing when there is an urgency to find solutions, by default, you end up turning to what you know. This is part. I mean, it's so in the book as well. I try to bring in theories from psychology and sociology. When you are embedded in certain institutions, when you are embedded in certain practices, it's very hard to change them. It's very hard to break them. It's very hard. It's very difficult to ask people to break them. Right now, it could be. I mean, we could have envisioned a different international political order. But there was a need to respond to the demand of the people at the time, right? And the demand and the most basic solution was forming a state. And if there was a challenge, then adopting the same ways, to address this challenge. So when communities in the periphery felt marginalized and secluded, when they felt that they were treated unjustly, they resorted to the thing that they were familiar with. It wasn't necessarily a conscious, right? It wasn't necessarily a conscious process. They didn't say, you don't see South Sudanese leaders say, we are anti-colonialists. We're trying to change the way people think about anti-colonialism. They're trying to gain justice. And the best way for them was to address the same practices that existed. In terms of as I mentioned, the eradication of culture, it was very much part of it. It was very much part of it. Sudanization was about eradicating the cultures, not just in the south, but in the Nuba Mountains and in Darfur. It's an essential part of state building. Sudan was not unique in that, right? Post-colonial states were not unique in that. Nation states, even France, right? Even France was becoming a nation state, it involved trying to eradicate or weaken peripheral culture, right? Banning people from speaking their tongue So it wasn't unique to them. I think what characterized the process of decolonization and the creation of the new states was the intensity of the process, right? It wasn't a gradual process. It was just, it was top down, very brutal, very quick. And that's what created this reality. Amanda, you asked about the context. In the book, I do mention the context, especially when I move, because there is a chapter in the book as well about this, again, the so-called second civil war. I think it was, the way I see it, it was one single civil war that lasted from the 1950s all the way to 2005. The context is actually crucial, right? I mean, as I mentioned, much of the thinking of, if you stick to what I presented, much of the thinking of the liberation, the Southern leaders and intellectuals, was the fact that they were part of the broader context. They did go and they met, when they went into exile, they met the liberation struggles in Mozambique and in Zimbabwe and in Zambia, and they went to Nigeria to attend the Pan-African Congress. So the context is very crucial, absolutely, because it was this context that they absorbed the ideas and practices. It didn't emerge in the vacuum. So yeah, I definitely. So in the book, I definitely pay attention to the context throughout the different periods. So I hope it was okay.
Oh yeah. Richard or yes, do you want to answer any?
No, I have a question, but
I'll answer very quickly.
And then
To Nazar.
And then Hakim.
To Nazar. Yes. The issue of eradication of culture of indigenous people, actually, it's within the concept of genocide. Anybody who tries to eradicate the culture of people or people is committing genocide. That obviously is wrong. It happened in Sudan, and it happened in South Sudan, and that is what led to the break of South Sudan. But the reason is not really that South Sudan should have involved in this behavior, because there was lack of imagination, from these people. They didn't sit down to think that, look, our diversity can be our strengths, and so we need to compromise so that we build a state, a nation that can take everybody in and progress and develop for the next generation. And this is the case we are facing in South Sudan, because the power in South Sudan right now, they are eradicating, using your words clearly, they are eradicating certain communities. And it is again the failure from Khartoum that is now transferred to South Sudan. And I think again you can see the rulers in Juba, they are completely unimaginative. They just have no clue of what they're with regards to why would separation happen in South Sudan if it is accepted anywhere. Well, that is something, given my own experience, I'm lucky enough to have lived in Sudan and now in South Sudan. Nobody is going to convince me to try to separate unless I know whether they can give us a complete blueprint, what identity, which relates to who I am exactly. What are they going to offer? How that state going to look? Because at the end, as Matthew says, it's going to be a war over resources. Every tribe will fight for resources, and it will not be about building a nation. What about Garang's perspective? I think Garang's perspective is a failure. It has brought us to where we are, and that will not help us. Thank you.
Hakim?
Yeah,
I will come to you, your question.
Just very briefly, in response to the question of whether the new vision, the new Sudan vision, will be successful or not. I think
South Sudan or Sudan?
South Sudan. South Sudan. I think that was the question.
Yes, indeed.
So the example that we live today shows you that habits are very hard to break. For example, SPLM is the bearer of this flag of New Sudan, and it has failed to translate that in reality because of the background. You've seen that it's a violent organization. It has not adapted itself to modernizing how state building, art house, of state building.
doesn't have the capacity. So they're carrying a vision which is far too big for them to be able to implement. We've seen that they're struggling with corruption, they allow themselves to go into war, they have avoided using means, democratic means or civil means for resolving conflict. There was no point of the country going into civil war in 2013, and all of this because of inability, lack of political will and wisdom to manage the new state. So that's, on account of all of that, the SPLM vision of the new Sudan is not working for us. That's one. And then the other question about separation, like say proliferation of new states, in the context like potentially, like say in South Sudan, proliferation of South Sudan into 3 states, for example. I think the politics is all about power, and it's about how you use that power when it is in your hands. What purpose do you apply that power for? And that is the basis of conflict. If you weigh that against peace, if there was another option for me to live peacefully, then in the context of what I see happening in South Sudan, for example, Equatoria, to a large extent, is far cohesive in terms of having a social fabric that has developed over time, and they are more law-abiding, they are more civil, they lack the violent problem solving, and therefore they constitute an example of what is missing in South Sudan in terms of a formative nation. You see, they have a sense of identity, and they're already in the process of becoming a nation that South Sudan should have been emulating, but this is not happening. And therefore comes the time of, we want to build a state, then democratization is at the core of this. And democratization means participation in decision making, and where people do not want to participate in decision making, I don't think that is the way as it is in Equatoria. The people of Equatoria want to participate in decision making, they want to enjoy their democratic rights, they want to live peacefully. And it's only on the basis of that, just calling on the basis of that, that they should have peace, so that they can preserve their existence as a peaceful democratic people, and that alone should justify for them to have a state. If the rest of South Sudan doesn't want to live in peace, then others who think that they want to live in peace should enjoy that democratic right. And I think this is the context of proliferation, possible proliferation of states in South Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Hakim, both Sudan and South Sudan, I'd love to see some constitution of any part. There are no constitutions. They just talk. Here, if it's conservative, liberal, they have constitution, and you could read it, and you could ask politicians saying, you said this, and yet you have not executed what you said. There is nothing. It's all the Communist Party, the Ba'athist Party in Sudan. And he said, what are they after? What do they want to do? Nothing. I have no idea. And they say, we have to be part of the government. And this is a fundamental mistake and a problem, certainly in Sudan and South Sudan too.
Yes, and in South Sudan, what we're proposing is that there should be a constitutional process that is people-led. And we've talked about people's conventions, constitutional conventions, so that we all sit down freely with each other and ask the question, can we live together peacefully? Can we respect each other's rights, each other's boundaries? If that is possible, then we can have a state. If that is not possible, then the proliferation of the state. And we're proposing this in the context of the union state. In a union state, people are sovereign, and they participate in this democratic participatory process to make the constitution and include
the component of self-determination, so that if any people, any region doesn't think that their interest is served by the union, they can opt out. If they think that there's sufficient consensus about the values, decision-making, participation, then they may opt to be part of this state, and we all grow together. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, behind you, please. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Ahmed Al-Shahi, and I hope that's not taken against me. I'm a visiting academic at St. Anthony's College, and I'm a professor of politics at George Mason University in the United States. I teach politics and government of the Middle East. And thank you very much, Professor Voller, for your presentation. And I must say, with all the discussion, I had to think, or it made me think of Algeria, another very large country in Africa, where they had the FIS, the French acronym for basically the Islamic Salvation Front, that fought for a political Islam, their version of political Islam. They had a 10-year civil war, very brutal, very strong military, and language was a big issue. Because again, overnight, they went from French to Arabic, and we have basically a segment, or a large segment of the population that became analphabet, as they say in French, i.e. basically illiterate, because Arabic just couldn't. So I was just wondering if you had looked at, or is Algeria, it's kind of out there, but in terms of, language, in terms of this insurgency, and also in terms of oil, that it is, a country that's fueled. And today it's an authoritarian country. It's a very closed country. And, so anyway, I just sort of put that out there as an interesting consideration. It made me think of it, okay, from the world I come from. And also I just wanted to ask, and so do excuse if it's just an issue of semantics, but in terms of a condominium versus colonial territory, and again, being originally Egyptian, I'm sorry, but I wasn't around back then. But anyway, but I'm just wondering that, okay, and not being a member of the Commonwealth, but still, it was colonialism. It was colonialism. So anyway, I'm sort of pushing back a little bit on that, and thank you for the opportunity.
I'm delighted to be a part of this. I'm Dr. Ahmed, and I did all those researches which by the presenters and the commentators. It's rather commendable question. I'll make it very short.
Yeah.
And well, I have an observation about really, you did a great job, and of course, actually, the book is very valuable, but I'm sorry, I have problems with the premises of the book. From the very first, addresses by observation about the colonization. Thanks to my colleagues from South Sudan, Elhag and Karim, they actually, I support their points, and this is how the Sudanese, broad Sudanese from South and North, and I have my own experience I can share. Maybe time will not allow, but I support the points that they raise. This is, if you ask my suggestion, I would actually name this book as the impact of the colonization rather than colonization and decolonization. And my colleagues here, they talk the issue about identity. This is one of the problems. And by the way, I'm from Sudan. I'm from Darfur actually, and I used to be part of the government. I was a former deputy ambassador of Sudan to the UK, and now I'm a PhD student at the university, doing something to do with the planet. Studying the AFCFTA, area. That's our issue, and I don't want to repeat what they have said. I support completely what has been said by Elhag and by Mr. Hakim. And also, so that's when we come to study the impact of the colonization, we will find out that what's our problem with that? Yes, it is that this is being inherited from those who were colonizing us, and I support what she said, this colonization. And Dr. Ahmed has been opted to join the Commonwealth, but refused earlier. Yeah, they refused officially. They said we don't know.
That's much after independence.
After independence, yes.
After,
yeah,
not at the time of
yes,
independence.
yes. Yeah, that's because it's actually everyone has to be opted to, because it's independent country. This decision should be taken by the Supreme Authority. So that is the and also maybe you can, although Elhag, which we hear, I a little bit will not agree with Elhag, but it has been said in in CPA, it's very rich actually. Whether it has from where it come, I don't know. I mean, if definitely there were actually a foreign kind of intervention. There was projected, and the two parties, influential parties from the both sides, but it is very rich actually. It has encompasses all the problems, and they have defined, the solutions. What is possible. So that's. I hope that you can also resonate your writings.
Mohammed, I'm sorry, teacher.
Thank you very much.
No. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you. This is a lot. Yes, what? Yes, Carlo, please.
Thank you, Professor. I do appreciate the contribution of the panel.
Thank you.
Talking of decolonization, I think if you want to change a community, you have to change the system of belief, to believe in themselves, and incorporate what is common with the human race. Most of colonized people are made to think not of themselves, they are part of copy of other people. Until you change the mind, the mental attitude of the people, they will not be liberated and they will not develop, because they will have no opinion about themselves. So I'm asking the panel, don't you agree with me that, like what Madam Rosemary said before, that African-led leaders, in particular, who think of themselves as independent human beings and who celebrate their culture, the leaders, I'm talking about leaders, not Africans. I'm talking about leaders. They have no opinion about themselves, low self-esteem. Therefore, they cannot develop a system of education that incorporates universal values and their own unique culture. Until you do that, there will be no decolonization of the mind. You have to decolonize the mind first. If the mind is not decolonized, there will be no liberation, there will be no freedom, there will be nothing. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got last two questions and we have to stop. Yeah. Sam.
Thank you very much to Yaniv and all the other
very short, very
commentators. From what has been going on in Sudan from the independence of South Sudan is that there has been failure to manage the diversity that Sudan has. And of course, that cascaded into South Sudan. Of course, South Sudan still is a diverse country with different regions and different tribes and different ethnicities within the country. And we have seen since April this year, we have been having a conflict with Sudan, in North Sudan, since 15th of April. My question to, if anyone will be able to answer it, is this. What has been happening that we have been running away from problems? Of course, the independence of South Sudan was running away from the problem that was in the Sudan, and that problem is still there. So I'm wondering if there are ways that the diversity, both in the Sudan and in South Sudan, can be properly managed, instead of running away from it. I've seen propositions from Hakim and Elhag about what the situation in the Sudan and about creating minor states. I'm not a proponent of any of that because I know it never achieves its goal at the end of the day. It is a temporary solution that breeds more problems. So I'm wondering if there are solutions that could be used to achieve diversity. I mean, to use our diversity as a strength instead of weakness.
Thank you. So, Akish?
Hi, my name is Akish Aduk. I'm from South Sudan, fascinating, South Programme. And your presentation was so fascinating, amazing, about the decolonisation stuff. But my question is, if in the Bibles we have there's a parable that says that there's a two men that's wearing the rock. He went to make a farm, and some of the seeds fell on the rocks and other fell on the good soil and other fell on the back of Sudan. When it was created, they didn't ask themselves. Sudan, main Sudan was when it was become independent, they didn't ask themselves who they belong to. I become Africans or Arabs or part of Arabization. So the issue was identity. So if the root cause it was in Sudan, and the states carrying on, whereas Sudan and South Sudan, the issue of identity. What is the solution to the issue of identity?
Thank you, Akish. Shall I give you the chance to answer very briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. First of all, it's very important for me to answer Muhammad's question, because I just want to clarify, not even for a second, say that colonialism is not the original sin. Of course, right? There's no way colonialism is responsible for almost all the problems we witness in terms of the formation of new states. Right? There's absolutely no way that I'm denying the responsibility of British colonialism for what we witnessed. But the question, I suppose, what I am trying to say is that when these states were actually created, and by the way, foreign European intervention continued, like it continued to be relevant. And some colleagues actually mentioned it, right, in relation to the CPA and the role of international actors involved in the CPA. This cannot be ignored. But I suppose that we also need to think about how the founders of the new state and the population, right, and the citizens of the new state, how they embraced, how they ended up adopting, how they ended up treating the reality that they were in, and that's, and again, there was no. I'm not putting the blame there on anyone. I'm just saying that they ended up could have tried to adopt a new identity, could have tried to think about a new solution. Maybe the reality was that they didn't. Why? Because there was certain psychological and sociological processes that prevented them. Humans, humans are imperfect. We have many problems, and one of our key problems is that we end up going back to the same solutions that we know, rather than trying to imagine a different solution. But that's the main problem. Heba, you asked a really interesting question. I think so. In this respect, by the way, another case I was very much interested in, and I started pursuing research in it. It was actually not in Nigeria, but the Sahrawi question. What's the Sahara? Yeah, it was it's a much better fit in terms of the experience. The only problem is that, in contrast to South Sudan and Iraqi Kurdistan, it could actually travel to the group, right? So that was one of the reasons I started, and I did research, and then There was a bit of a backlash. Oh, you didn't go there, you couldn't interview anyone, couldn't meet anyone. So I ended up sticking to where I could actually conduct research. I suppose, maybe if you have to go and look into the relations between not just peace and the army, but rather maybe the Tamazic yes, the communist question, exactly. Would there be an equivalent? I haven't done the research, but sure. Maybe. But again, I hope that the book and my ideas will serve as a platform for future research. So there you go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I think that I answered.
And Richard, do you have to answer? Maybe we've had enough questions. Not questions. No, okay, right.
I will answer to Carlo and Samuel. Yes, language is actually a tool that can be weaponized for good or for bad. We've seen language being used to colonize people mentally, and when you are colonized mentally, virtually you are no longer yourself. Your identity changes. And so I was thinking that Yaniv was going to put this openly, but he has covered it in the way he has explained. He has covered that. And I think it should be one of the elements of decolonization. So this is something that if you feel you are oppressed, you need to first maybe tick some boxes, the language and those kind of things, to regain your humanity, to regain who you are, as Rosemary would say, originality. With Samuel, yes, Samuel, Sudan failed because of the inability to manage diversity. South Sudan is failing also for the same reasons. But we have to ask ourselves, what has made this management of diversity a problem? In the Sudan, it was this issue that Dr. Ahmed has spoken about, the issue of Arabization and Islamization. Okay? That became central, and therefore, if you believe in that, and the state believes in that, they are not going to believe in any other ideology. So that ideology is the reason for why diversity cannot work in Sudan. And it is now the same reason in South Sudan. We have SPLM since 1983, which is now 40 years. Somebody born in 1883 is now 40 years. Somebody born 10 years after that is now 30 years. So the youngest would be about 20, 18. These people have all grown in an environment whereby there is one single group that constantly tells them we are born to rule. We are born to rule. And they show their power using all the means that have been described here. Violence, appropriation of economic resources of the country, and doing whatever they want to do. This does not allow a person to accept that others can be equal like them. Hence, these ideas, unless they are removed and thrown away, you cannot have diversity. And in South Sudan, the idea of born to rule, which actually gives SPLM, SPLA their power, empowers them, unless that is removed, we are not going to have. It's not the young people are not, it's the idea itself, which is now a disease for South Sudan. Thank you.
No, I think we finished question, as Richard said. Now, we have to turn to the last bit. Sorry, we have to lose the last bit. Where is Justin? Justin, can you please come in now? We have to, the last bit of the program.